and welcome to the France 24 interview. When it comes to the world of international diplomacy, there are few faces more recognisable than my guest. Kofi Annan, both during and after his time as the United Nations Secretary General, has played a part in some of the most significant events in recent history. Since leaving the UN, he's been an international mediator and a passionate advocate for issues close to his heart, such as poverty reduction, food security and the environment. It's the last of those issues, the environment, which brings him back home to Ghana as the keynote speaker in a conference called Forests for the Future. Mr. Annan, thank you very much for joining us here.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
Now, this conference comes off the back of pledges and commitments made on the sidelines of last year's Paris climate change talks. That deal, AFR 100, saw 10 African leaders commit 40 million hectares of degraded forest land for reforestation. We've seen climate change pledges and commitments be made in the past. I'm thinking Kyoto, I'm thinking talks in Copenhagen. What can be done, in your opinion, to make these commitments turn into concrete action?
First of all, I think these governments are also going to need help working with the international community, and they're going to also need funding. But I think it's doable if the promises which are made all around are kept. The promises by the African leaders, promises by the international community about support and financing that they would give, it can be done. The problem is we've had many promises in the past. Only promises which are kept are promises which matter. But I think committing to reforestation is a first step. And we need to work with them, encourage, sustain the pressure to get it done. We should also understand that the governments alone cannot do it. They need to work with the private sector, with private citizens, foundations, civil society. But if we are all committed and we sustain an effort, we will make progress.
Would it not be perhaps cheaper and perhaps simpler in some aspects to simply preserve the natural forest that we already have in place, to make that the priority?
Absolutely. I stress that too. We need to protect the forests we have today to avoid further deforestation. And the governments and the populations have to be alert. It is no use saying that we do not want rosewood cut, we don't want the timbers cut, and yet they are being cut every day, and they drive their heavy trucks across the country to go to the ports, particularly the illegal loggers. Who stops them? What happens when they get to the port? Where are the security forces which are supposed to ensure that the right thing is done? Have we made examples of any of the big illegal loggers? Have we set an example to send out the message that there are laws, they have to be respected, and we're going to fight this impunity, and to really get the word across that we are going to make sure it doesn't pay to cut these trees. And if we were to enforce the laws on the books, you will see the difference.
How significant do you think it is that this was an agreement made by African leaders at the Paris, or on the sidelines of the Paris talks, that it wasn't sort of international community making...
Yeah. No, I think it is important. It is their agreement, and they need to enforce it, and they can be pressed and pushed into enforcing it without them claiming that this is being imposed on us, by outsiders. So there is it's their commitment, and we're only asking them to live up to it.
Reforestation is an expensive business. I know in the past you were one of the first champions of corporate social responsibility. Do you see the private sector, when donor communities across the globe say they're strapped for cash, do you see the private sector as being more integral to sustainable development processes?
Oh, absolutely. The private sector has a very important role to play. They have resources, they have innovation, they have research, they can direct research to some of the problems that we face, and they have the ability to deliver. There's tendency in Africa sometimes to rely on governments alone. Governments cannot do it. Luckily, most African governments are now open to private sector involvement, and that will make a difference. And that was also the encouraging part about COP21 in Paris. For the first time, the private sector was very actively engaged, and because they will make a difference. And I'm really happy they and civil society have a role to play.
As I mentioned in the introduction, you've been a passionate advocate for the environment since leaving the United Nations Secretary General position in 2006. So it's nearly 10 years now since you've left the post. Looking back, perhaps at your time at the UN, were there any issues, environmental or otherwise, that you wish you'd maybe tackled?
It's an interesting question, because quite a few of the tough ones, like the war in Iraq, I was very much opposed to it right from the beginning. But the people waging the war were also equally determined. And in the end, we all know the results. I think on health issues, probably we could have made more noise and probably got greater attention on what I call the diseases of the poor. Because pharmaceutical companies sometimes don't want to put money doing research, because the attitude is they wouldn't have money to buy the medication anyway. And we saw it with Ebola. We knew 40 years ago it was there. We didn't do anything until it came back. We have it today with snake bites. The serum is expensive, difficult to get. The company that produces quite a bit of it, Pasteur Sanofi, is stopping it. And there are about 100,000 people who get bitten a year. How do we get them the serum? And although we raise health issues, but probably not broad enough when you see what is happening. And we should have not only raised the issue of diseases of the poor, but pushed for some mechanism for research on diseases that affect them and for reasonable pricing.
Can I just ask about another reform specifically to the UN that you have been passionate again talking about towards the end of your term, the UN Security Council reform, where you've called for expansion in the numbers of permanent seats and issues regarding the permanent veto. What do you think are the risks if those types of reforms don't happen?
I think if they don't happen, UN will face a serious challenge. First of all, you have emerging countries who are demanding and will demand place at the table, and their regions will support this. It is not the structure of the Council today is based on geopolitical realities of 1945. The world has changed, and the UN has to change and adapt and move along with it. It is not justifiable that the 4 European countries on the Council have 80% of the voting capacity. And all the emerging countries from India to Brazil, South Africa, have nothing. If they do not change and make space for them, sooner or later, the primacy of the Council will be challenged. If we want cooperation, these governments have to give up some of the power to make the participation of the emerging countries meaningful. If they don't, we are going to see destructive competition. We saw it we have an example. When China couldn't get the reforms it wanted with the IMF, it set up its own Asian infrastructure bank. Is it going to compete with the World Bank? Are they going to cooperate? What does that mean? Do we want to see the same on the political side with Security Council? Even if they don't set up a competing, they can just sit back and not necessarily accept or implement Council decisions. And so reform is necessary in today's world, and if we do, we will get cooperation in the long term. If we don't, we are heading for competition and potentially destructive one.
The UN Secretary General post is again vacant at the end of this year. You said yourself the world has changed tremendously even since you were head of the organisation. Are there any qualities that you think the new Secretary General should have, which perhaps weren't necessary when you were at the helm?
I think, first of all, let me say that I'm part of the elders, and we have a position that after 70 years, the time has come that we see a woman Secretary General in the post. When she arrives, I trust the member states will support and work with her. There's often a debate as to what is needed at the UN, a secretary or a general. And I have maintained that the Secretary General has to be both, and a general when it's necessary and provides secretarial support when it's required. And I'm sure the new Secretary General, when she arrives, will play those two roles very effectively. And I would urge the member states to support her in that role.
Thank you very much for speaking to us here on France 24.
Thank you very much.
And thank you too for watching. Stay tuned, plenty more coming up here on France 24.